of Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. I help along with Nadia Khan and Celine from Palestinian Youth Movement to help coordinate and organize this fight against the war on youth as one of our campaigns. Um, you might notice that you're muted when coming in, and I apologize for that. It's not our intention to police, but we've had a lot of Zoom bombers, especially in this War on Youth webinar. So we will have time for interactive discussions and allow people to unmute, as well as if you wanted to say anything, you could raise your hand to unmute, or raise your hand, we can unmute you, or you send a comment in the chat to one of the co-hosts to read out loud, or if you have a question. We are going to be recording this meeting, and we record all of our public Know Your Fight webinars that end up, and you can find it on our website and on YouTube probably around the weekend. I think that for our outline for today, we're going to start off with just a quick overview of what the campaign is and the various programs that we're trying to combat and fight. And then we're having 3 amazing presentations today from 3 different places that are all interconnected, both in terms of the state violence that they're experiencing, as well as the resistance that the people are engaging in, and that is Colombia, El Salvador, and Palestine. So we're going to start off with the overview of the programs, and then we're going to go to our first guest, which is CISPES, to talk about El Salvador. So maybe Nadia, are you able to jump in right now and talk a little bit about the campaign and give a quick overview of what that is?
Yes, no problem. I'll be turning on my video really shortly as well. But hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Good evening. My name is Nadia. I'm with Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. I'm also a high school teacher, and welcome to our meeting. Usually, our meetings against the fight, the war on youth, are the second Tuesdays. This month, we're having it on this third Tuesday. I'm really glad folks have joined us. I see one of my coworkers too. That's one of my folks from grad school too. So anyways, great to see folks here. So just to give a background basically on what is our fight, it's looking at how youth, young people, Black and brown and indigenous and queer and Muslim youth are basically criminalized and treated as threats to national security. And this is happening under this guise of anti-terrorism, anti-violent extremism laws. One particularly called Countering Violent Extremism, which is through the Department of Homeland Security. And basically, this program is modeled off of a program in England where essentially they've named and labeled different behaviors as quote unquote suspicious, indicating someone is on a pathway to radicalization, on a pathway to terrorism, and being radical is so some of these and then within that, within countering violent extremism, a specific set of FBI guidelines called Preventing Violent Extremism in Schools. And these are basically a set of guidelines by the FBI targeting K through 12, so young folks, and labeling behaviors as suspicious, such as being too much into your culture, expressing anger or frustration, feeling isolated, being a migrant, being in poverty, speaking against U.S. foreign policy. And so all of these behaviors essentially, which are very core to what it means to being young, are labeled as, potential indicators that a young person is going to become a violent extremist. And so with that, and I'll go ahead and turn my video on now as well. Hello. And so with that, the project is called prevent. And in England, anyone who works with youth is already considered a mandated reporter. So for those of us who work with youth, we know that the mandated reporting system is already very flawed, right? We know it's racist, we know it's white supremacist, and the way it is treated to criminalize our communities and our families. And so just imagine now adding this next layer. And so because we know because the US strategies, weaponry, funding, we know that working with other teachers have seen training sort of hinting at this. And we, looking at how the last few decades, the gang narrative has been used to criminalize Black and Brown youth and Black and Brown communities. And so what we see is this very explicit coming together of the gang narrative and this violent extreme narrative. And so for us, it's really important to in our fight to make that connection. So that's a really brief overview of the program. So of course, when we say war on youth, there's many wars on youth, which we'll be looking at today. But this is sort of Stop LAPD Spying. So we'll be hearing from a few folks and connecting with them as well. So I'm really happy to be here, and feel free to put any questions in the chat as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. And our first special guest today will be David and Karen from CISPES to talk a little bit about what's going on in El Salvador. So why don't you two try to share screen and launch in and give us a little bit of the context and the current situation and talking. Yeah, go for it.
Sounds good. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is David. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'll be joined by Karen, who will introduce herself right now. I'm gonna share my screen to a Canva 9-slide presentation. So 1 second, please. Presents. Okay, can folks see this? Can folks hear me? Cool, I see a thumbs up. So again, thank you so much. It's great to be here in this joint conversation with you all. Thank you, Nadia, for that introduction about the war on youth that's happening globally and our needs to connect our struggles and combat all these narratives that deprive us of our humanities. So I'll let Karen introduce herself. And I know Karen had some internet difficulties just shortly before, so I'll give her a quick sec to see if that's resolved.
Karen, can you unmute yourself?
Okay, so in the meantime, like Karen, I guess, is trying to resolve those. Oh, she's trying to enter the waiting room. Let's see, admit. Karen, can you hear us? And perhaps unmute yourself. Well, I guess while we're trying to figure that out, I can definitely get us started. We rehearsed, we were gonna split this up between the two of us. It looks like this will take about 20 to 25 minutes for this presentation. We have some opportunities to interact throughout, and we're looking forward to the Q&A towards the end to just put the struggle in El Salvador in global context as well. So I'll get started. My name is David again, with CISPES, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. I'll move to the next slide. Okay.
By the way, I'm here. I'm back. Sorry.
Oh. Hi, Karen. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sorry, y'all. I'm having technical difficulties. So my name is Karen. I use she, her pronouns. I'm here with CISPES LA. And I can get us started with this first slide. I'm going to have my camera off because I think that slows down my Wi-Fi. So Yeah, so pretty much who is CISPES? So we are an anti-imperialist grassroots organization that has been around since 1980. We were founded shortly after the war began, the Civil War. And since then, we have been accompanying the Salvadoran popular movement in their struggles for participatory democracy and economic justice. Our focus is on targeting US targets and trying to stop US intervention through various campaigns that are directly informed by folks in El Salvador. And we have 6 chapters across the country. And like we mentioned, David and I are here on behalf of the LA chapter. Can you go to the next slide?
Sure.
Thank you. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of historical context. So with the Civil War in El Salvador, you can see here I have like a timeline. Because of time constraints, I won't be able to get into everything, but I did want to touch on things. So whenever I've heard folks talk about the Civil War, I've heard folks always kind of start off in 1932 with La Matanza, which was the genocide of indigenous communities who were rising up against landowners. And so there was a whole like exploitative system where folks were being exploited and oppressed. And so there was an indigenous uprising, and unfortunately the Salvadoran military repressed that, and it led to a mass genocide. And the reason why I want to begin here as well is to honor as well, like you know, a lot of the revolutionary organizing that we see later on has its roots in this indigenous uprising. So I wanted to honor that. If we move on to the 1970s, we start to see a lot of organizing still happening. During this period, there's several military dictatorships that control El Salvador. And there's a landed oligarchy. And so a lot of oppression for peasants, for like rural farmers, campesinos rather, as well as indigenous communities. And so folks are organizing against that. As well, it's important to note that during this time, Israel is supplying 83% of imported arms, as well as training what will later become the death squads. And so the Civil War officially begins in 1980. And so this is a war between a guerrilla group under the umbrella of the Fmln and versus like the Salvadoran military. And so the United States like plays a big role during this time, funding pretty much the whole war. I have here that the United States was sending an average of $1 to $2 million a day to the Salvadoran military dictatorship to combat the guerrilla groups. And it left thousands and thousands of Salvadorans dead, and many more had to flee to the United States at this point. And so we see a large mass migration to the United States. And so the United States, like during this whole time, covers up their involvement with in the war, and especially their involvement with, I don't have it on here, but the 1980 massacre at El Mozote. And so the war ends in 1992 with the signing of the peace accords, where the Fmln officially becomes a political party. And then from 1992 to 2009, there are several like right-wing governments that take control. And we see the rollout of like neoliberalism in the country, of course, with US advisors. And during this time period, we see a lot of like privatization of public services, such as telecommunication and the pension system and electricity. And it's attempted to privatize water and healthcare. But those, due to like strong social movement organizing, those things are left unprivatized, but are still constantly under threat. So that's like, again, this is a lot, I know, and I totally condensed it, but happy to talk more about it at some other point. So I'll pass it on to David for the next part.
Thanks, Karen. And this history is really important because just recently, when we're faced with the crises, the humanitarian crises of asylum seekers reaching the US-Mexico borders, it's precisely because of US destabilizing policies in global southern countries that create the conditions of forced displacement, of collective trauma, and of the need for collective healing. So in this next slide, we'll be focusing on the criminalization of youth. As shared earlier again, the war on youth is a global onslaught, unfortunately, and resistance is a global promise of liberation. As we shared about Salvadoran identity formation, it's deeply transnational. The severity of the war, the mass trauma that it engendered, also led to creations of diaspora, and many traumatized youth, families, etc., divided, are making their way north, either to Chiapas in Mexico or also further north to cities such as Los Angeles, in the 80s, in the 90s, and still to this day. And so just the lived realities of non-English speaking peoples, perhaps darker skinned peoples, making their way to an unfamiliar environment, speaking an unfamiliar language, trying to survive, led to the formation of youth groups to protect themselves amidst hostile environments, particularly in the midst of the 80s, 90s, and the rise of neoliberalism, with the rise of jail expansion in California since the 1980s, the criminalization of youth. We see gang violence, the creation of MS-13, 18th Street, other gangs in the 80s, 90s, needs to be clarified that it is a product of US foreign policy and of neoliberal carceral regimes. Both, or especially in the United States, with the expansion of prisons in California, with the rise of broken windows policing in New York City, to stamp down on small levels of crime with very disciplinary punitive sanctions. All of this creates conditions of criminalization, exemplified, for example, through the Rampart scandal. Here, the Rampart Division Police Station off of 6th and Burlington, around there, MacArthur Park, and just how the police systemically harass, criminalize, terrorize, and cover up these forms of violence against youth who are trying to survive in a very hostile environment, and also how this is tied to the deportation system, deporting these youth to El Salvador, maybe folks that don't have a connection to this country, haven't lived there. And how MS-13, 18th Street, these gangs spread also in El Salvador, creating conditions of violence. And as we saw in the timeline before, the right-wing governments that emerge out of the 1992 peace accords, they adopt a very punitive stance towards any form of crime or any form of deviance that involves alleged gang-involved youth, but also queer folks, folks that do not fit a legible, quote unquote, gender binary. So policing is both state sanctioned, it also becomes an interpersonal project. And at least at the state level, in the 2000s, the Salvadoran state adopts mano dura policies. That translates to hard hand, tight fist, iron fist policies, very similar to broken windows policing. These policies made it illegal to be part of a gang. It criminalized youth, targeting youth ages 12 to 18 in El Salvador, and also anybody with a tattoo as a gang member and as someone that needed to be locked away, imprisoned, taken away from any support networks that actually could be the source of meeting and addressing folks' material needs, the collective trauma that is passed down intergenerationally, and trying to transform oneself and our society. So unfortunately, in the 2000s and beyond, these increased rates, these mano dura policies created increased rates of incarceration, as well as police abuse of civil rights. Due to the rampant violence existing across El Salvador, public safety, the notions of public safety became synonymous with militarization and the police as arbiters of safety. But unfortunately, and just youth today combat how safety means locking away and criminalizing youth. And that youth especially are pushing back to assert that to be youthful, to be rebellious, to be human, to allow to make mistakes or just exist is our human right, and that we need to, in any mentioning of a war on youth or in criminalization, pinpoint the origins of these violences, which our introduction explains. The origins of these conflicts exist in settler colonial formations, in the landed aristocracy that controls every form of political expression and just life. And we include here an image, it's called Bajo el Estigma. I'm gonna invite Karen just to talk a little bit about what this film poster is of.
Yeah, thank you. So this is Bajo el Estigma, or Under the Stigma, and it's it was a poster created by El Colectivo San Jacinto, which is a youth Salvadoran-based youth-led media collective, and they do really cool work. So I really encourage you all to follow them. And they put together this film where they talk about how being a young person is like a stigmatized identity because of the police targeting that they face. So I really encourage you all to check out their film. It's in Spanish and in English, and we can put the links in the chat. It's on YouTube, so I encourage you all to watch that.
Cool. Thank you so much, Karen. So I'll move on to the next slide. And any questions y'all have at any point, please just jot them down. Don't lose them, so that way we can be in conversation with them and draw our connections back to our siblings in Palestine and Colombia, here in LA as well. So moving on, I have a question for y'all. So I have two images here and a date. So we're gonna talk about the left one first. I'm not sure if folks have the ability to unmute themselves or not, or maybe hosts that can, but my question is, what do you see here in the left image? And maybe one person could start. Just go ahead.
Hamid, should we temporarily allow people to type in the chat right now? What do you think, Hamid?
Give me 1 second.
Thanks.
Yeah, please feel free to do that.
Cool. So drop what you see in the chat and we'll name what y'all put. So again, in the left, what do y'all see in the left image? A coup. Someone said a coup. Katie said a coup. What makes you think that? Who are the figures that we see here? What might suggest that? Military. The vests, they say ejército. Ejército translates to military. So overly armed military. They have hella weapons, state violence, puppets, army interrupting a legislative session. Bam, bingo. Ashley, you got it. So on the left is an image precisely of that, the army interrupting a legislative session. We'll talk more about what this is, the events of this, in the next slide. How about on the right image? What do we see? The drawing. I see puppets. So how about the right image? Feel free to drop it in the chat and I'll read it out. What do we see in the right image? Puppets controlled by money. Yes, at your service, it's interesting, it's a play of mi capitán, my captain, but the captain being capital of agents of the state, money coming out of a suit sleeve, US funding these puppets, military being funded. Great, thank you so much, everybody. Death, oof. Thank you, Mariela. So yeah, unfortunately, after both during the Civil War and in the post-Civil War peace that is unfolding, this path to democracy that is still so elusive in El Salvador, unfortunately, the reigning ideology guiding El Salvador is that of capital and of transnational capital, of neoliberalism, and of investment coming from US corporations that hijack public resources such as the pension, the nurses unions, the water itself, and trying to outsource or privatize these precious goods that belong to the earth and which need to remain in public hands with accountability, are instead subservient to capital and all of its anti-Black, anti-Indigenous manifestations. So I'm going to transition into the next slide. Thank you so much, everyone. And we're going to talk about the events of that legislative takeover. So the current president of El Salvador, his name is Nayib Bukele. And I'm going to talk about a plan that he's proposing called the Territorial Control Plan. So Nayib Bukele, he's a 38-year-old, pretty young, millennial, very tech savvy president, also of Palestinian descent, living in El Salvador. He is part of a party, which itself is new, called Nuevas Ideas, new ideas. Rhetorically, just by that name, they show we're new, we're different. And it's an attempt to show that we are different from the traditional left, the Fmln, as a guerrilla group, as a party, and the right, Arena, which actually was the death squads, becoming a political party. And he tries to distance himself from both the left and the right and profess a new path forward. And what is this new path? Well, very crucial to his campaign promises was the quote unquote promise of tackling gang violence and corruption. Although he tries to distinguish himself from the left and the right, everything he's done since his very few years in office has just raised the concern of rising authoritarianism and fascism across the country. This is demonstrated through his proximity to depose President Trump, particularly regarding the Safe Country agreements to prevent asylum seekers from seeking asylum in the United States, and instead to send asylum seekers to the first country they arrive to, such as Guatemala or El Salvador. And even during the Biden administration, President Bukele remains very, again, subservient to capital. And Biden, through his Alliance for Prosperity that he was spearheading it as early as 2015 as vice president under Barack Obama, was crafting a plan to kind of control the crisis of migration, or actually forced displacement, as early as 2015. And so really central to this plan, both the Alliance for Prosperity, but also the Territorial Control Plan, is tackling gang violence and corruption. If we just go back to that last image that we saw, it was of the Legislative Assembly being invaded by the military. And so on that day, a little bit over a year ago, February 10th, 2020, Bukele, the president, called on the army to invade the Legislative Assembly, made up of politicians across political parties, to ultimately to pressure, intimidate, threaten, and fast track the approval of a final phase of his territorial control plan. This final phase would require approval of a $109 million international loan. What's this money going to be used for? Well, it's going to be used to arm the police and the military, in particular to buy police vehicles, uniforms, surveillance equipment, and a helicopter. This is just one example of how President Bukele, in his very short span as president, is integrating the military and the police more and more into daily civilian life. This is a very increasingly alarming precedent that Bukele is normalizing across his moderate and right-wing supporters, and is also just gaining a lot of legitimacy in that people think that it's okay that the military, that the army, the police become the first responders of any form of crisis that affects the Salvadoran people. And just in these past 2-3 years, in El Salvador and globally, we've suffered many crises, not excluding COVID. So even during the COVID outbreak, Bukele has militarized the Honduras-El Salvador border at the province of Chalatenango. Since 2006, there is a C4 agreement that allows free passage between these, between Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, unrestricted access where folks do not need to provide passports. Because folks live, it's a very porous border. Folks live and commute on either side for work, for family, etc. And under the guise of halting in quote unquote infected COVID patients, but also quote unquote drug trafficking and arms trafficking, Bukele is militarizing that border, creating checkpoints across the border. And also Chalatenango is a historically leftist province with a lot of organizing grassroots activity. So this is both an invasion under the guise of COVID, under the guise of public health, to integrate the military into daily life. This is just a second example of how also Bukele is getting away with it. And what is very alarming is that the peace accords, which were signed in 1992, are hoping to deliver on a promise of a demilitarized El Salvador. And what Bukele is doing, and many folks are legitimizing, is the increasing militarization of daily life. The military becoming the first responders to any form of crisis, whether it be the crisis of unemployment, the crisis of public health, the crisis of imperialism, anti-Blackness, and anti-indigeneity. So that's a lot there, but I'm gonna move on. Let's see. Oh, sorry. You're up, Karen.
Okay, thank you. Oh no, wait, this is your section.
Political crisis, the coup.
Oh, okay. Sorry, it was lagging on my screen. Got it. Yeah. So now, so more recently, in addition to all the things that David has mentioned that have happened since Bukele took office and before, on May 1st, we saw what Salvadorans are calling a technical coup. So pretty much on May 1st, the new Legislative Assembly took office, and so following the elections in February. And so now there's a Nuevas Ideas majority in the Legislative Assembly. And so pretty much this means that they have the power to do many things. And one of the first things that they did on their first day in office was to remove 5 Supreme Court magistrates and the Attorney General. Technically, they do have the power to be able to do that. However, what made this illegal and unconstitutional is that it didn't follow the typical procedure that is laid out in the Constitution for how to remove Supreme Court magistrates and the Attorney General. And this was seen as like a very alarming thing, and called a technical coup because it felt like Bukele was basically doing like a power grab, right? And so not only does he have now control of the executive branch and the legislative branch, but now having control of the judiciary branch, there really isn't anymore like a sense of checks and balances in the country, which folks are really alarmed about. And in addition, he also has control of media, right? And like the airwaves. And so owning like his own news station and newspaper and radio. And the other news stations are also owned by oligarchic families. And so now there really isn't that much like checks and balances on this president, and that means that very dangerous things could happen. And since then, we've actually seen some of these things happen, right? So the Legislative Assembly has rejected bills that have been proposed by social movements and bills that they have actually worked on for years and years. So the first one that I have on here is the Gender Identity Law, which is a law that would allow trans and non-binary folks to be able to change their name and gender on their legal documents. And so that would allow them to have be able to exercise their right to vote and also have access to services. And so this law proposal was recently scrapped by the new Legislative Assembly. And a lot of folks, protested that and have been denouncing that. And asking the Legislative Assembly to take it back to the table. The other thing that was recently scrapped by the Legislative Assembly is a general water law. And so currently, believe it or not, water is actually not a human right yet in El Salvador. And so this means that it is subject to be able to be stolen by corporations. And that means that people don't have access to water, So this general water law is something that water defenders have been working on for years and years, have been working on this, and it's been on the table, and the Legislative Assembly recently scrapped that as well. So this is not very promising and doesn't bode well for what the Legislative Assembly will do. Folks are speculating that most likely the Legislative Assembly will take on more loans and more international debt, which working class people will eventually have to pay off. So it doesn't bode well. And so, of course, popular movements are resisting. The image at the top is folks who were actually took to the streets shortly after May 1st to denounce the Nueva Ciudad's decision. And, you know, folks are resisting. The LGBTQ movement is strong in denouncing the recent scrapping of the gender identity law. However, you know, popular movements have taken a big blow with this new president. And there's a lot of popular support for Nayib Bukele. I'm sure if y'all have like family who lives in El Salvador, or, you know, people really like him, very much like Trump, you know, has a very big following. And so, you know, popular movements are up against a lot. And so right now, even though they're resisting, it is still a critical moment, and a critical moment for our solidarity. So yeah, you can take it to the next slide.
Thank you, Karen. So finally, as we wrap up, we think it's important to stress our connections across borders. Unfortunately, the histories of settler colonialism, of imperialism, have united global fascisms to wage and unleash terror, whether it be across occupied Palestine, occupied Turtle Island, Central America, and beyond. And we've seen this historically, and we see this to this day as the US continues to fund Israel and provide more money to wage its assault on resisting peoples. So global fascist regimes, United States, Israel, the United Kingdom, military dictatorships across Latin America and beyond, they provide military training and financing. They also share surveillance and intelligence databases. This is historically so. An example is in the Andean countries of Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador. During the Cold War, military dictatorships in these countries participated in a US-backed and engineered plan called Operation Condor to create databases linking all of the individuals and groups that they labeled as threatening, as enemies, as communists, etc. A lot of these groups ended up being youth, organized students, environmental defenders, Afro-descended peoples, LGBT folks, workers, union members, leftists. These assaults are ingrained in the DNA of settler colonial states. They actively repress because the promise of liberation from Palestine to Turtle Island are so strong. Another example of how these fascist regimes collude even more recently is in 2015, former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, who, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he was an architect of broken windows policing in the 90s. He was actually brought in to El Salvador in 2015 to advise the country on security issues, public safety, and also like criminal justice reform. So again, we see just the connections between these mano dura policies that target and criminalize youth, with also broken windows policing, stop and frisk policies that disproportionately affect and target our Black siblings in New York City and across this country and elsewhere. And so all of this goes to show that these global fascist regimes that are unfortunately on the rise, they are very steadfast in their commitment to upholding what a lot of Black radical scholars term racial capitalism. The idea that the historical creations of like these nation states, the United States, Canada, Australia, Argentina, El Salvador, Israel, are very much based on securing inequality through exploitation, through the division of the means of production, and also racializing peoples to justify enslavement. Black people become chattel slavery, become chattel through chattel slavery, become property, become commodities to produce profits that then these countries, that these wealthy families hold onto and create their intergenerational wealth. So a lot of these colonial projects, which are ongoing, including Zionism, they're ongoing, at least in Central America and across the world. We see this through the rise of free trade agreements, whether it be the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994 that led to the uprising of the Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico, or also CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, again, where goods and services can move between borders, but people can't. All of this is kind of exemplary of the turn to neoliberalism. It's very similar and reliant upon privatization, where education becomes privatized, water becomes privatized. All of these life-affirming necessary entities to live, life itself, the earth itself, become commodities for extraction, for profit. And it's the land and water defenders from across Rhode Island in El Salvador who point to us the need to resist all of these onslaughts. And it's we have to also call out the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the US Agency for International Development, all of these financial institutions that work hand in hand with the United Nations, with the European Union. They're all complicit in these genocidal tactics. So just as we focus on, unfortunately, how these global fascist regimes unleash terror and havoc across our global oppressed communities, it's also crucial that in this particular moment, from Palestine to Turtle Island to Central America to elsewhere, that we are able to remain steadfast in our commitment to a better world, where we take direction in this uprising for Black life, in this uprising for Indigenous sovereignty. All these movements are connected, and we're very grateful to start off this conversation tonight and learn more about our siblings in the Palestinian freedom struggle and in the Colombian freedom struggle as well. So the next slide Karen will take, it's just us wrapping up, and it is, let's see, it's how we can take action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. And yes, this is the last thing because I know we've talked a lot super quick. I just wanted to invite you all to take action. And so CISPES currently has a campaign to cut military funds to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, as well as development aid that only funds like infrastructure projects that are harmful to local communities. So if you want to learn more and also send an email, a pre-written email, super easy, to your reps, you can go to this link, cispes.org/take action, and I'll be putting that in the chat. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I recommend you follow El Colectivo San Jacinto as well, which we referenced a few times during this presentation. And yeah, if you also want to just get involved, you know, you're interested in learning more about El Salvador, like we do have an LA chapter and we meet every other week. So if you're interested, like let me know in the chat or private message me in the chat and I can connect with you more. So yeah, thank you all so much for your attention and participation.
Thank you. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now. Thank you. I'll give 5 more seconds so folks can get down any info from the screen.
And you know, while they have that up, everyone, maybe we could take this moment. If you have any questions for David and Karen, you could put them in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function, and we can then unmute you or let you unmute. And I think that to give enough space for all 3 of the groups, we might do questions after each one rather than the panel at the end. So if you have any questions, now is the best time to ask too. Specifically for David and Karen. So post them in the chat if you have them, or use the raise hand function. You have a question in the chat from Charles saying, I was wondering why the Fmln seems to have lost so much popular support, particularly among younger generations.
Thank you for that question. Karen, do you want to try taking a stab at that?
Yeah. So the right now it's like a very dire moment, you know, for the left in El Salvador. And there actually is a lot of youth being involved with the Fmln right now. I think I feel like there's a lot of youth also involved in Nuevas Ideas, to be frank. But there is still, I think, youth being involved with the party. They have a youth secretariat, and I know that they're very active. I think overall, one of reasons why folks are overall disillusioned with the party has been just, I think there's a lot, to talk about there. But I think it's always important to contextualize, right, that the Fmln had the presidency for 10 years, and the right wing had control of the government everything before that, you know? So it's kind of hard in those 10 years to like undo everything that was done. And also not to mention that they did have the executive branch, but they didn't have control in the legislative assembly, and we're constantly facing a lot of pressure from the legislative assembly, as well as like within the Supreme Court. And so I'm happy to talk more about that more as well if folks are interested. But yeah, I think those are maybe some of the reasons why they have lost popularity, and I think people right now are also just really disillusioned with parties in general, and that's what has allowed Bukele to be so successful, is because he was able to separate himself from parties and say, I'm new, I'm different, like follow me, when in reality he is just kind of a reiteration of the right wing. So yeah.
And I think just to add on a little bit more nuance, unfortunately, like leftist political party constructions, especially upon reaching power, are battling like right-wing legislators. And even in 2015, because I think from 2009 till 2018, 2019, the left was in power under FMLN. And actually when Giuliani was invited to come in to advise on security, it was actually under a leftist administration. So, and that was much an example of how the left itself is also kind of backed into a corner where it has been almost pressured to adopt more neoliberal policies and public safety policies that further harm youth, queer folks, etc. So it's very nuanced how to use political systems, especially in a very fragile democracy such as El Salvador, where there are where collective healing still feels very elusive. So thank you so much for that question, Charles. And I think CISPES especially takes its command and its lead from social movement organizers on the ground. That includes LGBT organizers, militant women's unions, organized students, environmental defenders, and how these groups work in tandem with the Fmln, but also maybe sometimes outside or beyond it, in order to build mass power that political parties might not be able to ever capture. So yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to just say there is a question in the chat, but maybe Karen and David, would it be possible to answer it in the chat as we move on to the next person? And if you can answer publicly, because the question is a very useful one for all of us, which is, where can we find information to share with our families that is in Spanish and accurate? And maybe you could have some English accurate resources too. And I just wanted to also drop for everyone as we move on to PYM to talk about Palestine in the chat. There's going to be, so I put it in the, oops, I put it just privately. Here we go. So here's our campaign interest form for the War on Youth campaign. And also tomorrow at 6 p.m. we will be having a working meeting as well. So you can message Nadia or me with your email. We can send you the Zoom link to that at 6 p.m. tomorrow. And thank you so much, David and Karen. And we'll be moving on to Palestinian Youth Movement, represented by our very dear comrade, Ruby, who also has slides for us. So you could try to share slides and unmute. And then we'll be, stay tuned, because after that, we'll also be learning about the very important situation in Colombia as well. So
thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, David.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, David and Karen, for an awesome presentation. That was really, really insightful, and power to you all, solidarity with you all. So yeah, my name is Ruby. I go with she, her pronouns. I'm one of the general coordinators of the Palestinian Youth Movement, the chapter here in LA, OC, and IE. And I'm just going to share a little bit of information today. I want to give some background context, just a little bit about, just to set up the stage for like, what is Zionism, what is the occupation in Palestine, and then we can kind of move into some more current events. So I'm going to share my slides. Okay, so I just have a few slides that I want to share for just the beginning. But I just wanted to go over, I want to touch on some key terms that are really important to understand the Palestinian issue, because language is super important. Like, we don't want to use language like conflict or both sides. We want to very specifically and explicitly name that this is a situation of settler colonialism. This is ongoing ethnic cleansing, displacement, and a fight for Palestinian self-determination. So these terms are really, really important in understanding the issues that Palestinians face on the day-to-day, and just the like intergenerational trauma that's been inflicted through apartheid and ongoing ethnic cleansing. And then something that's super important is to understand Zionism. Zionism is the root cause of the occupation of Palestine. So I'm going to go into that in a little bit of detail. So just to read the definition here, Zionism is a settler colonial movement whose goal is the establishment of a Jewish state on the ruins and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. So this is a super important point, but Zionism and Judaism are not interchangeable. A lot of Jewish people can be anti-Zionist. Zionism is strictly a political party. It is not an identity. It is not an ethnicity and should not be conflated as so. So just want to emphasize that not all Zionists are Jewish and not all Jewish people are Zionists. Okay, so yeah, let me explain a little bit about the Palestinian Youth Movement, who we are. So the Palestinian Youth Movement is a transnational grassroots movement of young Palestinian and folks from the Solana region who are affected by the Zionist settler colonial project. We basically work towards the liberation of our land and people and dismantling Zionism in every form and for the right of return of all refugees. So now I'll just go into kind of like the history of Zionism. So Zionism actually began in the 19th century in Europe, and it was actually it was started by a group of very rich anti-Semitic Europeans, and it was seen as like a solution for anti-Semitism in Europe, was to create a party that was going to push the Jewish population out of Europe into a new nation state. And so it has a really, really disgusting and racist history, and that's really important to understand for like how the foundation of Zionism started. And when the Zionist party was founded in Europe in the 19th century, they were still trying to find a place to create this mission, to create this state. And they actually had this party met, and they were actually debating between creating a nation state in Argentina or Palestine. And they ended up choosing Palestine just so that they could use kind of the
Sorry, I was trying to let somebody in and accidentally muted you. I'm so sorry.
No, you're totally fine. But yeah, as I was saying, they ended up choosing Palestine to be able to use that messaging of like, this is a religious thing, and use that as justification for their plans to ethnically cleanse Palestinians and create this nation state. So that's something that not a lot of people know that's really important to understanding Zionism. And this is also super important because often you'll hear like the issue in Palestine, it's a religious issue, or it's been going on for centuries, but this isn't true. The Zionist party that created Israel is not a religious identity. It is simply a political agenda. It's a neoliberal agenda. It was a very lucrative plan, and that is really the foundation of it. So I just this is a passage that came from one of the original members of the Zionist party. So I just want to read like part of it, but the part in bold here, Zionist colonization, even the most restricted, must either be terminated or carried out in defiance of the will of the native population. An iron wall which the native cannot break through. This is in toto our policy towards the Arabs. So you can see it started off as, from the very get-go, it started off as a racist agenda. And it started off as with complete plans to, very intentional plans to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from the region. And just like a logistical thing, you'll see that Zionists never use the term Palestinian, but they always say Arab, because they don't want to even validate that the ethnicity of our like Palestinians and the people who are ethnically Palestinian, they don't want to validate that they're Palestinian. So they'll refer to them as Arabs, and you'll see this often. Okay, so just some quick history so that we can kind of understand like the structure of what things look like now. The first plan that started segmenting the region into what is like the state of Israel and the Palestinian territories, or what the UN calls it, happened in 1947. And at this time, it's really important to know that only 7% of the land was owned by the Jewish population that were starting to immigrate into Palestine. But although only 7% of the land was owned by European Jewish immigrants, the larger section of the partition plan, which is 55% of it, was dedicated to the state of Israel. And the 55% that was chosen, as you can see, it's not like split in half, because they took most of the very lush regions, and then left what you see in yellow as like the Palestinian territories. So this was the first division that was created in 1947, and basically with the UN giving permission for this. And at this time, the British were colonizing Palestine. So what happened was the UN gave this plan. The British then decided that they'll step out and give the okay for the Zionist Party to come in and basically put this plan into action. So in 1948, that's when the British withdrew their troops, and then the Zionist troops came in and had massacres and a mass displacement of Palestinians in what you see as the blue regions to create the state of Israel. So this region in blue is what is technically today, what you'll see on the map is called Israel. And what we call that is 48, because that is the land that we lost in 48. So later on in this presentation, you'll hear me talking about the 48 region, and this is what we're referring to. So all the Palestinians who were in the 48 region, or a majority of the Palestinians in those regions, were displaced to either the West Bank or neighboring Arab states like Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt. And most of the people were displaced to neighboring Arab states. And at the time, it was the largest population of refugees that were displaced at one time. So what we call this event is, we call it Nakba, which is the Arabic word for catastrophe. And that's what my grandparents' generation called it when it happened in 1948. But something that us as the PYM, we like to also use language to, make our point across, is that Nakba was not just an event that happened in 1948, it's ongoing. Nakba is continuing to happen till today. We still have land loss going on, we still have settler colonialism, we still have ethnic cleansing. So what happened in 1948 was just the beginning of this Zionist project to ethnically cleanse, to colonize, and to take over land. So this is a map just to better understand what we're working with today. So as you can see, 1948 is when they started to displace Palestinians from the land, trying to, again, put into practice what the UN partition plan designated as the land that they can take on. 1967 is when the neighboring Arab states lost control of, they were at the time patrolling different regions of Palestine and kind of stepping in against the Israeli military. And there was a 67 war, which was basically between the neighboring Arab states and the Israeli army. And after 67, which we kind of call like the second Nakba, we lost a lot of that land as well. And there was another mass displacement. So what you see in blue is the 48 region. And then what you see in white here is what we call the West Bank. And then this strip right here is Gaza. And so as you see, it's still getting smaller. And that's because, you know, Israel continues to take land. They use the apartheid wall to partition different neighborhoods within the West Bank that they plan to take. They built internationally illegal settlements on in the Palestinian territories, and the land that belongs to Palestine is shrinking, and displacement, ethnic cleansing is continuing. And that's why we say Nakba is ongoing. Okay, so I think that's all I'm gonna share when it comes to slides. But that's kind of a background of just how Zionism has affected Palestine and how we got to the point that we're at today. So just to go into that, kind of what I showed on the map, it's really important to know that different regions of Palestine have different effects of Zionist occupation. So the 48 regions, we can talk about 48 first. So those regions are technically Israel. They have everyone living in those regions have to live under Israeli law, Israeli courts, Israeli military and police, and that is a very apartheid-like system. The laws are put in place to hurt Palestinians and to not give them the same rights. Like you can't go to certain, you can't get through certain checkpoints unless you have an Israeli license plate. And it's really hard to get an Israeli license plate if you're Palestinian. And if you're Jewish and live anywhere in the world, you are able to be granted citizenship to Israel. But there are Palestinians who apply for citizenship and don't get it until like 6 years later, or if ever. So there are a lot of laws for the 48 region that really hurts their day-to-day life. And then of course, not to mention the ongoing violence that's perpetrated on the 48 region with the Israeli military consistently planning evictions and taking homes and invoking home displacement. And so that's kind of a little bit about the East Jerusalem region, or the 48 region. And then when we go into the West Bank has like 3 different zones. Each zone is kind of just a process for Israel to take over. So they have like zone A, B, and C with differing amounts of Israeli military control. And the Israeli military, although that is not technically the region that they can enforce, they still do. So for example, if you live in the West Bank and you want to get to the other side of your neighborhood or another city, you often have to go through 1 or 2 checkpoints that are controlled by Israeli military. So what you'll see is that people who, there's a major restriction of movement. Unemployment is like 50%, like a steady 50%, sometimes higher. And there's a lot of control by the Israeli military there. And you'll see a lot of segregation, like there are streets that only Israeli settlers can use, and those are really nice streets, and then the really small streets are only for Palestinians. So that's kind of what the situation is like in the West Bank. Just to like summarize, there's a lot more detail I could give, but just to kind of give you a better understanding. And then when we talk about Gaza is a very, very specific situation where they have a triple blockade, land, air, and water. So Gaza is basically an open air prison. It's been under siege for about 15 years now. And they are not able to access resources through air, land, or water. No one can exit or enter Gaza. Israel completely controls the borders and the blockade. Like for example, when COVID started, a lot of countries wanted to send COVID resources and testing kits to Gaza, but they weren't able to because Israel blocked it and took the resources for themselves. So that's something that's really important. Is Gaza is under very specific, a very specific type of occupation by the Israeli government. So that's a little bit about those 3 regions of Palestine and how that differs. So to get more into what's happening current day, and I'm sure some of you have seen some news articles about what's been going on in Palestine. So I'll just kind of give like an overview. So to be completely blunt, this is expected every year during Ramadan. Unfortunately, during Ramadan, the month of fasting for Muslims, it's become a trend that Israel often Gaza and starts attacking different occupied Palestinian regions during Ramadan because it's a very important time for the Muslims in Palestine. And so this time around, something that really blew up, and I hope some of you have heard about it, but a neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah in occupied East Jerusalem was given a notice by the Israeli government that 10 families were going to be kicked out of their homes and Israeli settlers were going to take over. And not only were they going to be kicked out of their homes and completely displaced, but they were also being required to pay a fee of, I think, the equivalent of like $20,000 per family to the Israeli government. And this is something that was decided on in Israeli courts. So this is something that you can definitely, it's a really good example of the apartheid system because this is something that's completely legal in Israeli courts. Whereas according to international law, it's very illegal. So that's just like a really good demonstration of that. And so Palestinians really mobilized around Sheikh Jarrah. A lot of the residents of Sheikh Jarrah started using, and this is really amazing and really important to note, is this is the first time that Palestinians have been able to kind of take control of the narrative, because I'm sure some of you have seen, but residents in Sheikh Jarrah were actually using live streams on Instagram and on Facebook to show like Israeli military forces actually kicking people out of their homes, and to show not only Israeli military, but also just Israeli settlers, like citizens of Israel, attacking Palestinians, just actually going into, I'm sorry, this is kind of explicit, but like going into Palestinian homes with like knives and trying to stab people to get them to leave their homes. And it's been almost surreal. And it's just the most explicit example that Nakba is ongoing, you know, something that Palestinians often heard as something that happened in 1948, like our families were kicked out of their homes. Israelis came in and they just took them over. Keys, decoration, everything just stayed in place. That was something that like my grandparents told me happened to them, because my families were from, my mom's side from Jerusalem, my dad's side from another city in 48 region. And it's just really surreal to see it on Instagram Live, because this is still happening today. And it's really important that we were able to get that on live, and to get that and to get people to see just like the severity of and the brutality of Israeli and Zionist occupation of Palestine. So when that happened, a lot of people started mobilizing in Sheikh Jarrah, which is like a 10-minute walk from Al-Aqsa, which is the third most holy site for Muslims. It's like it's a quarter. It's kind of like there are 2 mosques in an area, and it's surrounded by a wall that was built in like historic times. So that area is actually protected by international law. it's international property. It does not belong to Israel or any like state. And so when Palestinians started mobilizing in Sheikh Jarrah, they also started mobilizing in Aqsa and trying to protect Aqsa. And that is when Israel started to attack Aqsa. And that is something that that's not something that we see often. So that kind of really blew up resistance. So that was something that is really important to know here is that, like I said before, the West Bank, the occupied 48 region, and Gaza are all very divided, and they're all very, they all have very different, like day to day, they all have very different symptoms of settler colonialism. And when this happened, they were all united and they were all resisting the same way. And we're calling it almost like a third uprising because we've had 2 uprisings in our histories, which we call intifada. And we're calling this a third uprising because this is the first time that we've seen this much resistance in unity with the same call that's same call that we're hearing from all regions of occupied Palestine, and the same mobilizing that's happening. And so, so today in Palestine, there was a mass strike throughout all occupied territories where no one went to work, no one was out in the streets except for to engage in mass protests. So the moment right now is really important. It's the most important time to engage with the Palestinian cause and the liberation movement. And, you know, I really want to encourage you all to take action and look into it. And the calls that we're getting from back home is that people back home are asking us to just keep sharing because it's the first time we've been able to take control of the narrative little by little. And the way we're doing that is through social media. So we've been asked by families in Sheikh Jarrah and families in Gaza to please just on social media, share as much as you can. I'm gonna send a link in the chat. The PYM put together some resources and some people to follow. Some of the people on the list are residents of Sheikh Jarrah, so you can follow them and uplift any of the demands that they're making or any of the posts that they're sharing. And then at the beginning of that link, there's also a Palestine 101, which is a really good resource to like better understand the history of Zionism in Palestine and how the occupation has come to be what it is today. So yeah, I think I just want to end there with that call to action and to really encourage you all to check out that link and you know, engage with the Palestinian Youth Movement, engage with the actions we have. We have a lot planned this week. I think there's like almost an action a day. So definitely just, if you're interested in joining us with that, you can follow us on Instagram. I'll put our handle in the chat. And if you're interested in engaging with us or working with us, you can also fill out an interest form on our website. But yeah, I just want to end with that. And thank you so much for giving me the time to talk a little bit about what's going on now.
Thank you so much, Ruby, for that incredible presentation and for really breaking down some of the basics as well as the context for what led up to this, and, you know, definitely full love and solidarity and support for the Palestinian struggle. One thing, if you could answer just really quickly, tell everybody, one, a little bit about the connection specifically with the LAPD and Israeli police and military, and then 2, just about the BDS movement and how they can engage also by boycotting. And then after that, if possible, if people have any questions for Ruby, would you be able to stick around and answer some questions in the chat if people sent you questions in the chat while we moved on to the next presenter?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, yeah,
okay, so let me touch on, thank you for bringing those up. Yeah, so there's this thing that we like to call the deadly exchange, which is essentially the sharing of information and tactics and resources between LAPD and the Israeli military. And so we have like a codified process with like police forces in the US that actually go to Israel and they train with the Israeli military and they learn tactics and they bring them back here. And the LAPD is like one of the largest participants in that program. And you can definitely see it. And we saw it a lot in the BLM uprisings last year. A lot of the gear that LAPD was wearing and a lot of the like the rubber coated bullets and like the tear gas that they were using was exactly what is used on folks in Palestine or in Palestine. And we actually saw people in Palestine were actually sending us tips on how to combat the tear gas and resources on like how to deal with the rubber bullets and how to defend ourselves, because it's really just been like a copy and paste of what they've done there and what they've done here. So that's something that's really, really dangerous and really harmful for us. And then, sorry, the other thing you said was boycotting, right? Okay, yeah, so there's a movement that the Palestinians created in 2005 called BDS, or Boycott, Divest, Sanctions. I think I have a slide about it actually. But it's basically a call that Palestinians made back home asking people to boycott any like companies that support Israel, and specifically like the Israeli military. And the BDS movement has some calls that they made, which is like liberation of all Palestinians, the return of all Palestinian refugees to the land. And then I think a third one about like giving Palestinians on the land now equal rights in like legally. So definitely something to look into. If there are companies that you shop from a lot, it's really good to look it up and see if they support Israel in any way. Some companies that I know off the top of my head are like, I'm sorry if you use these, but like McDonald's, Victoria's Secret, HP, Sabra Hummus, Caterpillar. I don't think anyone uses Caterpillar, but Caterpillar, like SodaStream, and there's a bunch more, and there are a lot of lists that you can find online. Thank you for sharing that, Akil. But definitely, that's a really good way to show your support with Palestinians, just to kind of use that in your like everyday, just making sure that you're not giving more money to the Israeli military than we already do their taxpayer money. Yes, Puma is another one. But yeah, I'll hang around. Did I touch on everything you asked? Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll hang around if people have questions, and thank you so much for just listening and engaging with me in this space.
Thank you so much, Ruby. So everybody, please post your questions if you have any for Ruby in the chat. And Nadia, do you want to introduce or Mariela, do you want to introduce our next presenter?
Hello, everybody. So next, we'll be hearing from a group in Colombia called Red Comunitaria Trans. So aquí tenemos Daniela. Mucho gusto, Daniela, y muchas gracias por estar aquí. I'll also introduce Ale and Mariela as well, and they'll be helping with interpretation. And so I know, Mariela, you wanted to share that there's actually a number that folks can call in, and I'll go ahead and let Daniela talk about Red Comunitaria Trans and who they are and how we can support their fight. So Mariela, if you'd like to talk about the interpretation.
Hola.
Hola, Daniela.
Hola, ¿me escucha?
Sí.
Hola.
Hola, ¿cómo está, Daniela?
Bien, tengo muchos problemas de conexión porque aquí en Colombia están bloqueando las señales, sobre todo en las noches, pues como en esta situación, bloquean en las noches porque a esta hora es donde más la policía ataca a los civiles en las manifestaciones y paros. Entonces, para que la gente no hagan vivos, live, donde puedan denunciar o sea visible esta violencia. Entonces lo que hacen es bloquear las señales y a veces ni instalando VPNs funciona el internet. Entonces, lamento si mi comunicación es reducida.
Está bien, Daniela. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. And Daniela was just sharing about the connection problems due to the repression of what's happening, and due to also the government basically messing with the signals and people not being able to get, get through. And I wanted to just point to the chat. Ale actually put a phone number. I don't know, Mariela, are you able to unmute yourself now? I saw you couldn't, but
I could now, yes. Solo quiero compartir que la compañera Ale va a estar traduciendo. Así Daniela puede seguir hablando español y te van a poder escuchar en inglés si llaman al número que Ale Esparza puso en el chat. So everyone, if you need interpretation, sorry, it's loud here. Hold on, Mom, I'll take you right now. If you need interpretation to English, if you can call that number that Ale put on the chat, and that way you can hear the interpretation. And then Daniela will be speaking in Spanish. Sorry, I'm gonna mute again.
No problem, thank you. So I'm going to be asking Daniela questions. Daniela, yo te voy a preguntar las preguntas y también voy a poner las preguntas en el chat. I'll be putting the questions in the chat as well, so folks can follow along. So again, there is, for anyone who doesn't understand Spanish, there is the number in the chat to call in, where Ale and Mariela will be supporting with interpretation. So para empezar, Daniela, ¿puedes compartir sobre la red comunitaria trans y por qué es importante para la gente en Colombia?
La red comunitaria trans es una organización de base comunitaria, popular, callejera, que a través de pedagogías comunitarias hemos tenido un impacto no solamente a nivel barrial o a nivel comunitario, sino que ha sido un trabajo que ha tenido una trascendencia en lo latinoamericano y en otras partes también globales, donde este trabajo de ejemplo comunitario se convierte en un modelo de atención para personas trans, sobre todo mujeres trans trabajadoras sexuales, mujeres trans habitantes de calle y mujeres trans privadas de la libertad. Me gustaría saber un poco la dinámica de la traducción. ¿Tengo que esperar para que vayas traduciendo o voy hablando y tú me dices que cada tanto paro?
Sí, sí, gracias, Daniela. Ahora Ale y Mariela están traduciendo con un número. So, las personas que no entienden español están llamando un número que pusieron en el chat. So puedes seguir hablando. Gracias.
Ok, listo. Entonces, la Red Comunitaria Trans es una organización creada por mujeres trans trabajadoras sexuales del barrio Santa Fe en el año 2012, en un periodo donde además, digamos que Colombia siempre ha estado en un conflicto armado, lleva más de 50 años de conflicto armado en Colombia, y parte de ese desplazamiento y conflicto armado en el que vivimos sucede en el barrio desde donde nosotras ejercemos el trabajo sexual o construimos nuestras vidas, porque en general muchas de las mujeres trans venimos desplazadas de otros territorios a raíz del conflicto armado en Colombia, y luego nosotras nos encontramos en este barrio que tiene también unas problemáticas muy grandes de violencia, narcotráfico y conflicto. Y luego como desde este territorio hemos vivido esta mal llamada limpieza social, que es un genocidio o un exterminio de las personas pobres, y pues como nosotros hacemos parte de esos círculos de pobreza en los que nos toca construir la identidad, pues hacemos parte también, personas trans han sido víctimas de este genocidio y de este exterminio. Entonces, lo que pasa es que, digamos, en la situación, en comparación a otras personas, no sé, a líderes sociales, o además era que los casos eran visibles y denunciados. En el caso de las compañeras trans no eran ni visibles ni denunciados. Entonces siempre quedaban los crímenes en total impunidad no había investigación, nunca había justicia en los casos y siempre quedaban como crímenes pasionales o crímenes que son correctivos porque se lo merecen por ser ladronas, ¿no? Por ser prostitutas. Bajo esos calificativos y esta criminalización de la identidad, pues nos asesinaban y no quedaba nada. Entonces la red comunitaria trans nace primero desde el miedo, del miedo a ser la siguiente en ser asesinada. Esto es creado por muchas compañeras trans y también en homenaje y memoria de muchas compañeras trans que son muy jóvenes y que fueron asesinadas. Y luego la rabia, ¿no? La rabia de ver la impunidad, de ver esta injusticia. Entonces, como esos dos sentires, el miedo y la rabia nos junta frente a pararnos y a decir, nosotras como putas trans nos paramos desde el Santa Fe a hablar por nosotras y sin, o sea, además para ese momento también había un movimiento naciente LGBT en el que no, pues nunca hemos tenido cabida, ¿no? Un movimiento que es clasista, misógino, falocéntrico, patriarcal, capitalista, religioso, o sea, como que reproduce una cantidad de opresiones y de cosas pues que con las que nosotras no estamos de acuerdo y con las que hemos tenido que batallar todo el tiempo. Entonces, nunca encontramos apoyo o respaldo en el movimiento o en la población LGBT, pues porque además, porque era una cosa mediada por la clase, ¿no? Como van a ser unas trans, putas, pobres, ñeras, guarras, visajosas, populares, parte de este grupo tan selecto LGBT1, ¿no? Que por lo general se piensan que es blanco mestizo, clasista. Entonces, como nosotras no entrábamos en esto, lo que decidimos fue irnos por otras partes y digamos que los espacios de participación ciudadana no son muchos. Entonces la red comunitaria trans encuentra en el arte una herramienta de incidencia política y de participación ciudadana muy interesante. Y es a través del arte que hemos podido incidir, ser visibles y transformar. Eso por un lado, y por el otro es todo el trabajo comunitario, ese trabajo de barrio, ese trabajo popular, que es el que nos ha permitido estar unidas y trabajar de la mano de las compañeras trabajadoras sexuales. Y pues eso es la red comunitaria trans y es muy importante porque además, digamos que en el patrimonio digamos en el patrimonio cultural y artístico del país, hemos, digamos, a través de nuestro trabajo y de todos los procesos artísticos que hemos hecho, unos aportes muy valiosos al arte y la cultura en Colombia, pero también a los procesos académicos, acompañando procesos de formación de profesionales en las universidades. Entonces eso también trasciende y desde muchos puntos, desde la salud, desde la participación ciudadana y sobre todo desde el arte, siempre hemos podido hacer mucha incidencia, ¿no? Y desde la movilización también.
Sí, gracias Daniela por compartir todo esto y todo el trabajo que ustedes están haciendo ahí, pues muy importante y necesario. Y también quería preguntar que si nos puedes dar un poco de información de qué está pasando ahora en Colombia y también cómo es que se afecta a personas transgéneros y género no conforme. Un poquito de información de lo que está pasando y cómo afectan a ustedes.
Ahorita Colombia estamos en peligro, la policía está matando a todo el mundo, realmente la situación es miedosa y difícil. Acá llevamos mucho tiempo de mucha guerra, de mucho conflicto, pero últimamente esas heridas se han profundizado más, porque la guerra lleva muchos años tocándonos, la corrupción en este país es una cosa muy grande, vivimos en un narcoestado, ¿no? que los que nos hacen la política acá son unos narcoterroristas. Entonces esas son las condiciones desde las que nos tenemos que parar. Además a esto, sumándole todo lo de la pandemia y la pobreza que eso ha dejado en el país, cómo ha aumentado los niveles de pobreza y desigualdad y de inequidad en el país y en la gente más pobre, ¿no? Es donde más se ha sentido el rigor. Y luego, además de eso, de estar viviendo una situación de pobreza, de estar viviendo un conflicto armado, de estar en una situación súper difícil, a eso le aumentan una reforma tributaria donde encarecían los alimentos de la canasta básica familiar. Y ya cuando empezó a pasar esa situación, pues todo el mundo se volcó a las calles, salió, que además también era súper absurdo porque anteriormente a eso estamos movilizándonos desde el 2019 realmente. Desde el 21 de noviembre del 2019, cuando empezaron a asesinar a mucha gente, líderes sociales, y esas denuncias que se hacían todo el tiempo, que se hacían visibles, nunca habían resultados y nunca pasaba nada en esos casos, porque además esos mismos asesinatos son hechos por policías y militares en nuestro país. Entonces, pues realmente es muy dolorosa la situación, la gente está en las calles, han habido ya casi 50 personas asesinadas por manos de la policía, han habido más de 35 personas que le han sacado los ojos, han habido más de 16 casos de violencia sexual contra mujeres, hay más de 200 personas desaparecidas. Realmente la situación es muy dolorosa y es bien complicada. Y nos están matando por todo. Es como, y sobre todo a estas horas en las noches, con la gente está manifestándose y está en las calles. Entonces apagan la luz, cortan el internet, hacen 10.000 cosas para matar a mucha gente, para torturar. Entonces, pues esa es la situación ahora. Y lo peor de todo es que hay unas personas que son como de la mesa de diálogo, que hablan con el presidente, pero es una gente que primero, claro, gente de miembros sindicales y demás, pero hay gente que lleva mucho tiempo en el poder y que les ha legitimado. Entonces siempre buscan a esta gente para legitimarse en ellos y no hacen al final nada. Lo que hacen es sabotear el proceso de mucha gente que sí está detrás, pero que no, o sea, que no corresponden a esos intereses que ellos plantean. Entonces, pues es muy triste porque además quienes están en las calles somos los jóvenes, son las personas jóvenes las que están asesinando, son las personas jóvenes a las que están violando, y viene una gente súper mayor a hablar por estas personas. Y bueno, en total en esta mesa de diálogo con el presidente, hoy salió diciendo que iba a reforzar, o sea, que iba a doblar las fuerzas militares, que iba con más rigurosidad, porque pues no reconoce, no acepta, es una persona súper soberbia, estúpida, que solo es funcional a unos intereses de banqueros y de políticos, que también son paramilitares. Entonces realmente pues la situación sí es bien triste y complicada. Nos están matando de verdad. Y ya no sé qué más decirles, que no, que digamos que en medio de todo este dolor, lo único, pues como que a uno le soporta, es como la esperanza de ver la gente unida en la calle, que no le importaba si no se estén matando, siguen en las calles, siguen dando sus vidas. Pero realmente es horrible. Y es muy desesperanzador porque además no hay voluntad política, no hay formas de mediar o de negociar, porque solo nos callan con balas. Los medios son horribles, la prensa, la televisión, como los canales oficiales acá en Colombia, reproducen unos discursos de odio contra las personas que protestan en las calles. Lo que hacen es reforzar estereotipos que realmente no son, no dicen la verdad, solo son serviles al poder, y a un poder que asesina, ¿no? Ese poder que niega lo que está ocurriendo con la gente. La gente se está muriendo de hambre también, porque ni siquiera puede pasar la comida, tampoco hay mucha cosa, está parada la comida por los camioneros, hay varios gremios que pararon, y al parar pues no entran alimentos a las ciudades. Pero digamos que eso no es lo grave es que es igual entrar a la comida a las ciudades, la gente no tiene cómo pagarla, entonces de nada sirve, porque además la han encarecido muchísimo. realmente es bien desastrosa la situación. Quisiera no tomar una postura, no sé, revictimizante ni nada de eso, pero pues o sea, lo que les estoy diciendo es la pura verdad de lo que está pasando acá. Y sí, digamos que por un lado es esperanzador ver eso, ¿no? La gente reunida, la gente en las calles, la gente gritando, la gente parando, la gente estando quieta, la gente en juntanza, y al mismo tiempo también ver cómo nos asesinan solo por estar manifestándonos, por no estar de acuerdo, porque no hay diálogo, no se puede dialogar con balas, no se puede dialogar con alguien que tiene un uniforme que cuesta más de 80 millones de pesos, que tiene armas y que tiene balas, y que yo solamente tengo piedras. ¿Sabes cómo es tan injusto y tan desigual? Y eso es lo que está pasando ahora en Colombia. Y eso cómo nos afecta como personas trans. Realmente es muy loco, porque todo lo que la gente está viviendo hoy en día es lo que nosotras vivimos a diario, es lo que vivimos en este barrio tan horrible, tan hostil, tan violento. Es lo que nosotras hemos vivido todo el tiempo, esta situación de precariedad, de encierro, de violencia policial en unos niveles muy fuertes, tortura, violencia sexual por parte de las policías. Claro, lo que era una realidad de unas pocas personas, ¿no? De los grupos empobrecidos, de esos grupos marginalizados, pues esta siempre ha sido nuestra realidad. Siempre nos mata, la policía siempre nos asesina, siempre nos vulnera. Y sí, pues también estamos en unos círculos de pobreza donde hay muchas necesidades. Y esto que nos pasa a nosotras, a estos grupos minorizados, pues ahora le está pasando a todo el país. Entonces, por eso, pues también es visible, ¿no? Porque ahora toca a todo el mundo, porque ahora sí toca a lo cisgénero, porque toca a lo blanco, cis, mestizo, ¿sabes? Porque antes igual estaba, solo que no era visible, porque no había escalado de estas formas. Pero igual nosotras siempre lo hemos vivido. Y es muy triste también, porque todo esto pues lo que hace es ahondar más nuestras situaciones, es profundizar más esa pobreza en la que nosotras pues tenemos que construir nuestra identidad. Entonces el panorama pues realmente no es muy alentador por ese lado.
Sí, gracias Daniela. Y te quería decir, no sé si puedes ver el chat, pero muchas personas están mandando sus, su amor, sus abrazos y todo, porque sí, la verdad, yo también te quiero mandar un abrazo y mucho amor, porque lo que compartiste, yo sé que, eso lleva mucha energía para compartir lo que acabas de compartir con nosotros. So antes de preguntar cómo podemos apoyar, te quería decir esto, que gracias por hacer ese trabajo de estar aquí con nosotros, especialmente con todo lo que están pasando, y como dices, que hasta qué punto tiene que llegar para ser visible, ¿verdad? Pero sí, quería preguntarte, Daniela, porque hablaste de cómo se impacta a los jóvenes, a gente transgénero, y también, pues tengo dos preguntas sobre, primero es cómo están creyendo poder comunitario. Ustedes, pues es muy obvio, pero también sí puedes hablar un poco de eso, y también cómo es que personas como nosotros en Los Ángeles, cómo podemos apoyar tu lucha de ustedes.
Gracias por los mensajes de apoyo y gracias por darme en este espacio, y también por escuchar lo que está pasando en Colombia, que realmente es bien delicado. Respecto a lo que tú dices, mira, nosotras también como, sí es muy doloroso y todo lo que pasamos, pero también resistimos frente a eso y somos resilientes, ¿no? Y nos paramos duro desde lo comunitario, desde la calle. Digamos que en cierta medida ellos tenían el poder porque nosotras teníamos miedo, y ahora ya no tenemos miedo, entonces ellos no tienen poder. y se los hemos demostrado a través de Tolopozungo. Tolopozungo es un movimiento travesti, maricón, queer, disidente del género y de la identidad, que se para desde unas posturas muy críticas. Es como Tolopozungo es un acrónimo que significa todos los policías son una gonorrea, que acá pues es como una palabra como una grosería, como una palabrota. Entonces, y gonorrea es porque pues, es una enfermedad, ¿no? Y que además es una palabra para ofender a los tombos o para hablar mal de los tombos, para referirnos como realmente son, pero desde una palabra que no es putofóbica, no es transfóbica, no es especista, no es misógina, ¿no? Como acá un poco, Tolopozungo viene siendo como una versión de colonial y travesti de la CAP, que la CAP igual pues primero es una cosa gringa, que acá en nuestro país pues no pega, y que además también tiene como una connotación misógina, ¿no? Porque acá esto de bastard es como echarle la culpa a la mamá por la existencia del policía, y lo que nosotros pues decimos, no es culpa de la mamá, y no decimos que los tombos, que los policías no son unos hijueputas, porque las putas no parimos tombos, no parimos policías, pues. Entonces por eso como que nos alejamos de estas cosas misóginas, machistas, patriarcales, y buscamos un término, y Tolopozungo pues es una palabra súper sonora, y lo hemos, como todo este término, lo hemos convertido en un movimiento que ha tomado forma en un grupo de baile, de voguing, ¿no? Que el vogue pues tiene toda esta escena que viene también de una cultura afroamericana, latina, travesti, de putas, de bol, pero entonces lo que hicimos fue sacar acá en Colombia esta escena que solamente pasaban como en la disco, en el bol, en las fiestas, a volverlo parte del movimiento como una forma de resistencia frente a la policía. Entonces, por ejemplo, acá la policía, nosotras hicimos un informe con la Universidad de California, en el que nosotras hacíamos como un histórico desde 1976 hasta el 2020, donde hay recopilación de cómo opera esa violencia policial en las mujeres trans. Como era antes de la Constitución de 1991, donde era criminal e ilegal ser una persona trans, y a ti te llevaban a la cárcel por ser una persona trans, ¿no? Como esa violencia policial operaba, y se supone, entre comillas, cómo cambia esa violencia luego de esa Constitución del 91, donde además la policía pues empieza a tener más financiación, empieza a tener más equipos, más armamento, más carros. Entonces lo que hace, y además pues esta Constitución del 91 reconoce a las personas trans, ¿no? Como en su libre desarrollo de la personalidad, bla, 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 bla. Casi que dejamos de ser criminales, entre comillas, en la Constitución, pero pues eso no se ve reflejado frente al abuso y la violencia policial, sino lo que hace también es como una exacerbación de lo mismo, ¿no? Si bien veníamos y nos asesinaban, igual pasaba tortura, violencia sexual, o sea, este informe recoge muchas de estas violencias sufridas por nuestras compañeras. Desde 1976 hasta la fecha, estamos diciendo que estamos, o sea, que todo esto que estamos haciendo con Tolopozungo tiene unas bases desde un estudio que se hizo desde los 80s. Eso por un lado, pero además, por otro lado, no solo nos quedamos como investigando, pobrecitas, lo que les pasa a las chicas, o que, ¿sabes? Como, ay, qué pesar y lástima, pobrecitas, las personas trans y cómo reciben la violencia. No nos quedamos como en este discurso ONGero que muchas veces se quedan, ¿no? Y que solo muestran cifras, pero que no pasa nada, sino que además hicimos una investigación sobre los protocolos de atención de la policía, cómo operaban, cuáles eran sus formas, cómo esos manuales iban también cambiando desde los 80 hasta la actualidad. Entonces era muy loco porque también era como pervertir, como subvertir esta cosa de casi siempre las poblaciones son las que son investigadas, pero no son las trans las que están haciendo la investigación. Entonces en este caso sí pasó así, y es como nosotras pudimos ver esos manuales, ver esos protocolos, y pues las razones que usan para ejercer ese orden y ese control, pues se da cuenta que también son sesgados por unas visiones religiosas, fascistas, misóginas, ¿no? De una transfobia y una putofobia muy fuerte. Entonces en esos manuales pues uno puede entender, ¿no? Cómo es la mente también de los policías y cómo funcionan y cómo operan, ¿no? Entonces, y pues este informe ha sido interesante porque luego de eso dijimos, ¿qué vamos a hacer con esa información? ¿Cómo se las hacemos llegar a las compañeras, no? ¿Cómo hablar de violencia policial cuando es un tema que nos toca a todas y que es un tema que rechazamos y que no queremos antes como alejarnos porque es doloroso, ¿no? Es doloroso cómo nos ha tocado, cómo desde la violencia sexual como un acto correctivo por parte de la policía, pues hace parte de eso que nosotras llamamos y que nos dimos cuenta con esto, diciendo, o sea, estudiando y haciendo esta investigación, y llegamos a la conclusión, dicho hace parte de la investigación, aparece como la violencia policial como una política de Estado, pero además la violencia policial como una política de Estado de exterminio del travesti, de las trans, de las putas. Y cómo se ve eso reflejado en las calles, ¿no? Cómo nos disparan ellos con pistolas estas de balines y nos pegan en las tetas, en los glúteos, en las piernas, en el rostro, donde muchas hemos hecho estas construcciones de nuestra identidad, ¿no? Es afectar esa construcción de mujer que yo tengo, es afectar esa identidad que yo he construido. Y pues eso es una forma de exterminio. Hay muchas compañeras que han sido afectadas en su cuerpo por estas pistolas de balines, que eso habla de esta violencia. Claro, hay casos más fuertes, ¿no? De violación por parte de 7, 8 policías, de robos por parte de las policías a las trabajadoras sexuales, de cobros de impuestos para poder trabajar en las zonas por parte de los policías. Entonces los policías también hacen explotación sexual, ¿no? Son unos proxenetas. Y en la que no, digamos, aporte o pague este impuesto, pues termina siendo golpeada, humillada, llevada a la UPJ por esto mismo y desterrada de esta zona. Entonces, frente a tanta violencia policial y frente a estas situaciones que además intentar, por ejemplo, denunciarlas es horrible, porque han habido casos donde, por ejemplo, pasó el caso de una compañera que se llama Dana, y la compañera recibió una patada en la cara que le tumbó todos los dientes de arriba, de la patada que le dio el tombo, el policía. Entonces, ella quiso denunciar porque tenía mucha indignación y rabia por la situación que le había pasado. Ella quería que además la policía le respondiera por una prótesis dental para poder recuperar su dentadura, que era lo mínimo que pudieran hacer una institución, pues porque fue una persona de la institución quien lo hizo. Entonces, nosotras acompañamos esta demanda y luego empezamos a recibir denuncias al punto que la compañera desistió de seguir con la denuncia. Ya el caso iba por buen camino, iba llegando hasta la fiscalía y eso. Y después los policías se dieron cuenta dónde vivía ella y la esperaron afuera de su casa. Y la querían montar en una moto a la fuerza, secuestrada, como un rapto. Y si no hubiera sido por unos vecinos, tal vez ella hubiera estado desaparecida. Y por eso a partir de eso decidió no hacerlo más. Y dejamos el caso ahí porque si ella no seguía denunciando, si ella no estaba al frente del caso, no podíamos hacer nada nosotros. Y como eso tenemos muchos casos registrados de violencia muy grave, pero además también decimos que es una política de Estado, porque acá cuando empezó la pandemia del COVID-19 el año pasado, implementó una alcaldesa, la alcaldesa de Bogotá, que es abiertamente lesbiana, una mujer que se reconoce lesbiana, es la primera alcaldesa lesbiana en Bogotá, implementó un decreto que fue la medida del pico y género, y era que obligaba a la gente a salir por el género. Entonces también fue muy triste. La salud emocional de muchas personas trans se vio afectada, pues porque imagínate que no solamente era dejar a merced del cuidado de la vigilancia de la policía, sino que además podían ser el policía del género y decir si yo le parecía hoy muy mujer o no, si yo para ella, para un policía era masculino o femenino, así mi documento dijera que yo era femenina, pero el prejuicio y la transfobia era tanta que no nos dejaban ni entrar a mercar, a comprar nuestra comida. Y además era muy difícil salir porque uno no podía salir todos los días. Entonces muchas personas trans las pasamos muy mal durante días, porque preferíamos no salir a la calle, no comprar mercado, con tal de no exponernos a estas situaciones tan horribles. Y aún, o sea, era tan consciente la alcaldesa que había hecho este decreto del pico y género que creó una línea de atención para casos de violencia policial. Entonces, cuando hizo un decreto como el pico y género y al mismo tiempo crea una línea, es porque ella como alcalde y jefe de los policías en el distrito sabía que la policía nos violenta. Luego en un foro ella misma le dice que es que el 8% de los casos denunciados de violencia policial es a personas trans. ¿Y cómo un número tan alto va a suceder a un grupo tan minorizado como la población trans? Como un grupo tan minoritario y tan minorizado, tan pequeño de personas trans, la violencia policial es una cosa exacerbada. Entonces, pues ese es el panorama frente a la policía y como a partir de todas estas realidades y cosas dijimos pues qué hacer, ¿no? Cómo hablarles a las chicas cuando tenemos tanto miedo frente a todo lo que sucede con la policía. Y ahí creamos Tolopozungo y entonces Tolopozungo deja de ser solamente un acrónimo para desahogar toda la rabia contra la policía y empieza a tomar cuerpo en este grupo de voguing. Y como a través del bow y del cuerpo, ¿no? Como a través del twerk, de además que esta cosa que es censurada, ¿no? La identidad, la sensualidad, la sexualidad, lo erótico, ¿no? Estas cosas que siempre son satanizadas, ¿no? Por ser de putas, por ser cosas que deben estar en lo oculto, en lo clandestino. Como a partir del cuerpo mismo, nosotros empezamos a usarlo como un arma de respuesta frente a la violencia policial. Y se les nota cómo se te ponen incómodos cuando uno les bate el culo en la cara, ¿sabes? Y les pone las tetas sobre el escudo, y cómo se corren hacia atrás, se van hacia atrás, se van hacia atrás, hasta que nos dejan libre el espacio y los encerramos, los acorralamos con las tetas y con el culo, ¿sabes? Como con eso, o sea, por esas tetas es que tú me matas, por este culo es que tú me matas, por ser maricón es que tú me matas. Entonces con este mismo cuerpo que exterminas, este cuerpo es mi arma y revierto mi violencia contra ti con arte, con baile, con lo único que tengo, con mi única arma. Y pues ha sido muy poderoso, ¿sabes? Nunca me imaginé que una cosa que una noche pasó acá en la cabeza se iba a convertir en un movimiento que ha tomado mucha fuerza, porque Tolopozungo no es solamente de las travestis, sino Tolopozungo es una palabra que se está apropiando todo el mundo, ¿no? Y que la estampa, y que la dibuja, y que la grafitea, y que está en todos lados, que empieza a hacer, porque pues también desde esta visión de colonial y travesti, pues es interesante todo lo que ha ocurrido. Y ver la fuerza de las compañeras, ¿no? Como compañeras, por ejemplo, que han entrado al grupo, han hecho sus tránsitos dentro del grupo de Tolopozungo, como otras compañeras que no eran cercanas a los procesos comunitarios, como a través del voguing y el perreo y ¿sabes? y la sensualidad y la guaracha y la champeta y el reggaetón han entrado a ser partícipes de, hey, es que la violencia policial también me toca a mí, me parece horrible, y esta me parece una gran forma de combatirla. Entonces, ha sido maravilloso como una apuesta artística, cultural, que ha tomado muchísima fuerza y que además uno sí ve el efecto en la policía, ¿no? Cómo se corre, cómo se niegan, como que están ahí, pero les cuesta ver esos cuerpos enfrente, ¿no? Como ese miedo también, ese miedo que genera el cuerpo en ellos, ¿no? El miedo de ver a una persona con tanta determinación y con tanta autonomía, paradas, sin un arma, solo en tangas, que además también usamos los colores verdes de la misma policía, usamos como en esta psicología del color, usámoslos porque ellos escogen ese color para poderse, o sea, la policía usa un color distintivo para luego reconocerse entre la comunidad. Además, históricamente, la policía, digamos, escoge un color para reconocerse, por ejemplo, en casos de caos, saben a quién no tienen que dispararle, ¿no? Porque es su compañero que le ven reconocido con este color. Pues ahora eso se les va a perder, esta información, porque son todas las maricas, travestis y putas que ellos odian, vestidos con el mismo color de su traje de uniforme. Entonces, sí, es como empezar a subvertir todas estas simbologías que construyen ellos mismos, ¿no? Y lo llamamos un escuadrón transmarica y utilizamos, cogimos el manual, los policías tienen como en sus marchas unos manuales de posar y que ponen las manos acá y que se tienen un rango, ¿sabes? Como, y cogimos todo eso y lo bogueamos, entonces empezamos a hacer esos movimientos, pero con las manos, lo mariqueábamos más, ¿sabes? Y pues es empezar a usar esas mismas tácticas de la policía, pero para combatir su violencia, para hablarles y ponerles en la cara su violencia, ¿no? Y ahí el mensaje coge otra fuerza, toma otra cosa, y Toloposungo pues ha sido un movimiento maravilloso en el que muchas personas han creído, se han unido artistas, se han unido diseñadores, se han unido gente queer, gente no binaria, que también ha sido maravilloso eso, ¿no? También ha dado la posibilidad de hablar de otras formas de transitar más libres, más fluidas, más amorosas, no como las que nos ha tocado, por ejemplo, a las travestis de la calle. Y ha sido maravilloso, realmente se ha vuelto como un grupo encantador, muy poderoso, muy visible. Si quieres, mi hermana, compárteles las imágenes un poco de lo que fue este domingo. Nosotros nos reunimos en el marco del paro nacional, también con nuestra apuesta. Llevamos realmente más días saliendo, pero fue como Toloposungo el domingo, como una convocatoria increíble donde se reunieron personas que además en medio de la pandemia y un paro, pues es difícil convocar y movilizar gente, pero pues lo hemos logrado. ¿No logras compartir? A ver.
No sé cómo. Hamid, I'm not sure. Are you able to give Amy permission to screen share? Estoy pidiendo que sí puede dar permiso para que pueda compartir.
Sure. Amy, I thought had. Oh, just give me 1 second. Please go ahead and try it now.
No te escuchamos, Daniela. Estás en mute.
Okay. Ahora sí, hola. Ella es Alexandra, una compañera de la red comunitaria trans, hace parte de la organización, y ahí estamos justo hablándole a los policías de Cali, donde torturan y han violado sexualmente a compañeras trans en una zona de Bogotá. Además es como irónico y lógico cómo funciona la institucionalidad, ¿no? Y cómo entre ellos mismos se solapan y se tapan y se ocultan, porque la alcaldía les entrega un reconocimiento como LGBTI friendly, que es absurdo, a este CAI, que es donde más han torturado a personas trans. De hecho, de esos casos acompañamos el caso de una compañera que le apretaron tan duro su seno que a partir de, o sea, como un policía en tortura le pellizcaba sus pezones y se los volteaba, y en eso, como ella estaba en un procedimiento hormonal para sus senos, fue tan fuerte y tan doloroso que le deja un tumor, ¿no? Le genera un tumor. Entonces, y eso, o sea, habla de los casos. Entonces ahí estábamos hablándoles a los policías, confrontándolos y diciéndoles, y si ven, pues miran, usamos el mismo tono, el mismo color en sus trajes. Si quieres pasar fotos. El escuadrón Transmarica, Tolopozungo, son las banderas de nuestra lucha, y este es nuestro traje. Este es nuestro uniforme de resistencia. Esta soy yo. Bueno, y como este movimiento en general también habla de estas violencias estructurales históricas que hemos vivido, ¿no? La gente rara, la gente pobre, la gente queer, las putas. Esta es una artista, por ejemplo, ¿no? Se han unido artistas, se han unido muchísima gente de, sabes, que ni siquiera son personas trans, pero que esto les llega, ¿no? La forma en cómo nosotras damos estos mensajes. Entonces, mira, ya en un punto la marcha se volvió tan fuerte que nosotras empezamos a tumbar las motos de los policías, las llenamos con pintura roja, les decíamos asesinos, nos organizábamos y les bailábamos eso hasta al frente de la estación de policía. Y pues este es el trabajo que hemos hecho entre varias casas de voguing, organizaciones trans, comunitarias, organizaciones de trabajadoras sexuales, grupos de gente queer, gente de universidad, sí, como muchísimas personas unidas alrededor de esto, ¿no? Los grupos canábicos, por ejemplo, también, ¿no? De estos parches que hablan de las sustancias psicoactivas, o por ejemplo también de los grupos que hablan sobre la legalización de la marihuana, porque también pues se vive mucho estigma y discriminación por ser usuario del cannabis en Colombia, ¿no? Hay mucha violencia y represión contra ese tema, y pues finalmente, o sea, no les interesa la legalización porque ganan más dinero sin legalizarla, obviamente. Entonces, sí, es como un poco de lo que nosotras hacemos. Acá, por ejemplo, también están las infancias trans. Siguiente. Ella es Luna, una compañerita también trans, una niña trans, que va con su familia siempre apoyándonos, también vestida con el color de Tolopozungo. Y ha sido maravilloso también porque pues se construye un movimiento alrededor bien interesante donde sobrepasa lo trans, ¿no? Y la violencia que surge frente a las personas trans, que es exacerbada y que también llega a otras personas. Entonces también es lindo porque es como un punto de encuentro con otros grupos que no, con los que no habíamos trabajado, con los que no habíamos tenido la oportunidad de participar o de incidir. Entonces lo trans también empieza a ser interseccional, ¿no? Y a hablar y sí, a negociar y a hacer y a conseguir aliados y a trabajar en red con otros movimientos. Y ha sido muy lindo y poderoso. Y realmente, pues, digamos que estas cosas a uno le llenan de esperanza y de mucha vida, ¿no? Estar ahí en ese escenario después de vivir a diario muertes y muertes y desaparecidos, pues es realmente maravilloso poder sentir en medio de tanta angustia, respirar un minutico de justicia, poderles decir a la cara lo horribles que son. Y sí, y hacerles caer en cuenta cómo esta institución les lava el cerebro, ¿no? Y cómo les pone en contra de su mismo pueblo. Y eso es parte de lo que les decimos siempre a los policías, ¿no? Como eres un hijo de personas empobrecidas, vienes también desplazado de familia campesina, ¿sabes? ¿Cómo te puedes poner en contra de otra persona que es igual de empobrecida solamente por cuidar una pared o por cuidarle el banco a los ricos, ¿no? Como que, ¿cómo puede más valer una vida, cómo puede más valer una pared que una vida? Entonces ha sido maravilloso y poderoso poder tener este espacio de Tolopozungo como una respuesta frente a la violencia policial. ¿Y cómo nos pueden apoyar? Necesitamos más conocimiento sobre cuáles son esas formas, porque acá pues, siento que es una utopía hablar de abolición policial, pero sí podemos hablar de desescalar el financiamiento a la policía, solo que necesitamos más recursos, fortalecimientos en saberes, por ejemplo, ¿no? En saber más cosas para estar más fortalecidas. También, pues todo este trabajo, todo lo hacemos de forma voluntaria y gratuita y pues a veces los recursos no nos dejan seguir haciendo cosas que quisiéramos. Por ejemplo, nos gustaría ofrecerles cada vez que nos reunimos con las compañeras comida, un subsidio de transporte y son cosas que no podemos darle. La gran mayoría de personas que ustedes ven acá es gente empobrecida, es gente que la pasa bien mal, pero que deja un espacio, un momento para encontrarse, para reunirse, para estar, ¿no? Estar y hacer parte de este proceso. Así que son muchísimas formas de fortalecer, de apoyar desde Los Ángeles y desde cualquier parte del mundo. Y es haciendo visible esto de Tolopozungo, es poniendo el hashtag de Tolopozungo, es compartiendo las cosas que estamos haciendo, ¿no? Como que hay muchas formas de apoyar y respaldar esta lucha y todas son válidas y bienvenidas y abrazadas. Y también nosotras estamos haciendo en medio de esta búsqueda tener una casa trans en Colombia, tener un espacio trans, travesti, queer, porque nos toca pedir cómo gestionar el espacio para poder ensayar la danza, el baile, y pues a veces eso no es tan fácil y menos en tiempos de pandemia. El prejuicio de la gente cuando ves que somos trans, pues es difícil que nos presten el espacio, por lo de la pandemia, piensan que somos un foco de infección del COVID, entonces siempre nos ven con mucho prejuicio y encontrar un sitio seguro para poder ensayar es difícil, entonces pues también queremos tener la Casa Trans, que es un espacio pensado para las compañeras trabajadoras sexuales del barrio Santa Fe y también para Tolopozungo. Y bueno, pues eso es un poco de lo que hacemos desde el arte, la resistencia, el trabajo comunitario, callejero y popular, y pues de estas formas resistimos frente a toda esta violencia y frente a esta situación tan horrible de paro que llevamos en estos días.
Wow, Daniela, tanto poder que acabas de compartir con todos nosotros y pues hay muchos comentarios en el chat también que pues sí, es lo que acabas de compartir es algo muy lindo, muy poderoso. Y como dicen todos, estamos con ustedes, pues no podemos en persona, pero sí estamos. Y gracias por estar aquí, por todo lo que haces y también por dar esa energía a nosotros hoy, porque esa energía es muy sagrada y lleva mucho. Gracias por estar aquí. Y también podemos poner, están pidiendo si ustedes tienen Venmo o Cash App, si personas quieren apoyar con fondos, o PayPal también.
Ajá, como PayPal.
Ok.
A través de PayPal podremos hacer.
¿Y el nombre de PayPal?
Ya,
Es...
si quieres les comparto y el GoFundMe también, espera.
Okay.
Ah.
So the question, if there's still any folks who are English only left, the question was around supporting with funds. And so that's the links that are going to be shared right now.
Dame un segundito, ya te lo envío.
Okay. Okay.
Mira, lo voy a poner acá en el chat. Voy a poner la campaña que estamos haciendo para lo de la casa. Y también me gustaría compartirles un videoclip del grupo de Tolopozungo para que lo puedan disfrutar. Es bien lindo. Es un trabajo que hicimos súper lindo. Me gustaría compartirse. Y pues muchísimas gracias por este tiempo tan maravilloso.
Sí, gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Y pues sí, yo sé que ustedes han sido en contacto con nuestro grupo también y pues la verdad de mi corazón yo quiero seguir eso y pues cómo podemos apoyar uno a otro pues aquí desde Los Ángeles a Colombia, El Salvador, a Palestina, a todos los lados. Gracias otra vez, Daniela.
No, muchísimas gracias y articulemos. Gracias por el apoyo, por la escucha, por acompañarnos. Sí. Y bueno, solo amor.
Sí, mucho amor.
Y creo que ya se los envié. Mira, este de YouTube para que lo puedan guardar o ver. Es bien lindo. Y es la canción como oficial de Tolopozungo, porque tenemos también un himno.
Sí.
Entonces,
sí, pues gracias por
nada.
compartir esos links y gracias a todos por poner los links en el chat. So yeah, I mean, I think tonight, hoy ha sido una noche para enseñar tanto poder que la gente que tenemos en nuestras comunidades y pues yo hablo como una persona aquí en Los Ángeles, la responsabilidad que yo tengo viviendo en un país que causa tanto, destrucción en el mundo también y qué podemos hacer y cómo podemos seguir apoyando uno a otro. So gracias a todos. Thank you all of you, Daniela, David, Karen, Ruby. Really, just thank you all for being here. Thank you for sharing your struggles, sharing your hearts, and yeah, definitely we'll this recording will be on. We'll post it on the website. And ese vamos a estar grabando, estamos grabando también para que ustedes puedan ver en el website. Después les podemos mandar el link. So we can definitely be putting that link. We'll put it on our website. And yeah, and so just to kind of close this, basically want to thank again everybody and also remind folks too, if you want to join the fight, reach out to us, Stop LAPD Spying. You can reach out to all the folks I imagine who've been here today, CISPES, Palestinian Youth Movement, Red Comunitaria Trans, and yeah, and we do have a meeting next Tuesday as well, which looks at data and policing, land and policing. So inviting you folks to come there as well. And yeah, I don't know if Akil, would you like to add anything?
Just blown away and floored by these just incredible, powerful presentations, and really grateful for all of you. And also for the thoughtful questions and comments that are full of love in the chat. So yeah, I just feel, yeah, anyway. I also just wanted to remind on a more logistical note that we also have our meeting tomorrow at 6 for the War on Youth Working Group. And if you are interested in attending that, that's where we're specifically tackling programs such as countering violent extremism, preventing violent extremism, these surveillance programs. Feel free to send me or Nadia a message in the Zoom chat right now. We can send you the Zoom link for that. That's tomorrow at 6. And yeah, and join next Tuesday for the more public webinar about data-driven policing and land and policing.
All right, y'all, we'll go ahead and be closing it. If you do decide to, I'll also put our emails in the chat if you do decide to reach out. Akil, if you want to put yours as well. I don't have it off the top of my head. But thank you all. Wishing you a good night. Muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí con nosotros. Mucho amor a ustedes y aquí estamos para uno y otro. We're here for each other. Bye, you all. Have a good night. Good night. Buenas noches. Mua, mua.
Chao, gracias.
Chao.
Thank you, everyone. See y'all later.
Thank you so much,
Bye.
David. Guys.
Good night.
Oh, absolutely. Let me post it. Do you want me to email it to? So I see a comment from Giselle asking for it. Would you like me to email it to you, or you want me to send it to you the Zoom link right now? Okay, if you can post your email, I'll send it to you right now. Okay. Absolutely.